The photographs stopped telling us something around 1902. Not gradually, not through some documented shift in photographic practices or archival methods. They just stop. Images of cities half buried under earth and rubble, buildings with their first floors sunken below street level, entire neighborhoods showing clear evidence of catastrophic sediment displacement. These photographs existed in abundance through the 1860s, 70s, 80s, even into the 1890s. Then silence. The cameras didn't stop working. The photographers didn't lose interest. Something else happened. The story changed. And with that change, an entire generation vanished from official record. This isn't speculation. Pull up city archives from San Francisco, Chicago, New York, London, Paris, St. Petersburg. Search for documentation of the people who lived through what we've been calling the Mudflood. The survivors. The witnesses. The generation that watched their cities transform. That saw streets raised, buildings modified, entire ground floors converted to basements. Where are their accounts? Where are their testimonies? Where are the systematic interviews? The oral histories? The written records of what they experienced? They don't exist. Not because they were never created, but because they were never preserved. Or more accurately, they were actively excluded from the historical record. The generation that survived the Mudflood, whatever it actually was, became the generation nobody talks about. And that silence wasn't accidental. Start with the simplest question. If a catastrophic event buried cities under meters of earth and sediment, sometime in the mid to late 1800s, there would have been survivors. Lots of them. People who remembered what the streets looked like before. People who watched the transformation happen. People who participated in the recovery, the digging out, the rebuilding. These individuals would have had stories. They would have talked to their children, their grandchildren. They would have left records. Except when you search for those records, you find something disturbing. The documentation that should exist. The first-hand accounts of experiencing this transformation. They're conspicuously absent. What you find instead are second-hand explanations. Official narratives written decades later. Architectural histories that describe the changes without ever asking the people who lived through them what actually happened. The survivor testimony, the most valuable historical evidence imaginable, was systematically ignored. Look at San Francisco. The city shows clear evidence of street raising in the post-gold rush era. Entire blocks lifted, buildings modified, ground floors buried. This wasn't subtle. This was a massive infrastructure project that would have involved thousands of workers and affected every resident. Yet when historians describe this period, they focus on city planning decisions, on municipal improvement projects, on the vision of civic leaders. They never quote the workers who did the digging. They never interview the families whose homes were affected. They never preserve the testimony of people who actually watched it happen. The pattern repeats across every major city that shows mudflood evidence. Raised streets, buried architecture, modified buildings, all documented in photographs and city records. But the human experience of that transformation missing. The voices of the people who lived through it erased, not lost through time or accident, but excluded from the beginning, as if someone decided their perspective wasn't worth recording. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why would survivor testimony be deliberately excluded from historical records? What could they have said that official narratives needed to avoid? The answer becomes clearer when you examine what little documentation survived, despite the systematic exclusion. In city archives, buried in municipal records, you occasionally find fragments. A letter from a resident complaining about street modifications, a petition from property owners objecting to construction that is burying their buildings, a legal dispute over who should pay for the massive earth-moving operations changing the urban landscape. These fragments tell a different story than the official histories. They suggest the changes weren't always welcomed. They hint at confusion, resistance, even fear about what was happening to familiar neighborhoods. But these fragments never made it into the published histories. The books written about urban development in the 1800s describe visionary leaders and progressive improvement projects. They celebrate the transformation of primitive settlements into modern cities. They never mention that some residents didn't understand what was happening or why. They certainly never suggest that the official explanations didn't make sense to the people actually experiencing the changes. The photographs from this period show something historians rarely acknowledge. They show people, not just buildings and streets, but individuals standing in the changed landscape looking confused, displaced, uncertain. There is a photograph from Chicago circa 1875 showing a family standing in front of a building whose first floor is now halfway below street level. The family isn't celebrating urban progress. They look bewildered. The photograph was filed in an archive and never published in any historical account of Chicago's development. Another image, this one from New York around 1880. Workers digging out a building, removing earth from what used to be ground level. Their faces show exhaustion, not the satisfaction of civic improvement. The photograph exists, but it doesn't appear in books about New York's Gilded Age. It contradicts the narrative of rapid, welcomed progress. These visual records of human experience were systematically excluded from the official story. And that exclusion extended to something even more significant: the demographic record of who these people actually were. When you examine census data from cities that show clear mudflood evidence, strange patterns emerge. Population numbers that don't quite add up. Demographic shifts that seem impossibly rapid. Entire neighborhoods where resident lists change completely within a single decade, far beyond what normal migration patterns would explain. It is as if the population didn't just change, it was replaced. Take St. Petersburg. The city shows extensive evidence of raised streets and buried architecture throughout the 1800s. Census records from this period exist, but they're remarkably sparse compared to later decades. Resident registries that should document who lived through these changes are incomplete, fragmentary, or simply missing. The demographic record of the survivor generation was never properly maintained, or it was maintained and then removed. The same pattern appears in London, Paris, Chicago, San Francisco. Wherever mudflood evidence exists, the documentation of who lived through it becomes suspiciously incomplete. Not everywhere. Not for everyone, but specifically for the generation that would have witnessed the transformation. Their names, their addresses, their testimonies, all remarkably absent from historical preservation. This demographic silence becomes even more disturbing when you examine institutional records. Hospitals should have admission records from this period. Schools should have enrollment data. Churches should have membership lists. These institutions were meticulous record keepers. Yet for the specific decades when the mudflood evidence suggests catastrophic change, institutional records become patchy, incomplete, or destroyed in fires that seem to cluster in this exact period with suspicious frequency. The fires deserve special attention. Between 1850 and 1900, an unusually high number of archive fires destroyed records in cities showing mudflood evidence. The Chicago fire of 1871 famously destroyed municipal records, but it wasn't alone. Archive fires in San Francisco, New York, London, Paris, all during the critical period when survivor testimony should have been documented. The fires were real, the destruction was documented, but the timing and targets suggest something beyond random accident. After each fire, records were reconstructed. But the reconstruction process involved selection. Some types of records were prioritized for restoration. Others were not. And consistently, across multiple cities, the records that weren't prioritized were precisely the ones that would have preserved survivor accounts of experiencing urban transformation. Census fragments were reconstructed. Property ownership records were rebuilt, but personal testimony, individual accounts, the human experience of watching cities change. That was considered less important, less worth recovering. The systematic exclusion of survivor testimony extended beyond written records. It affected memory itself. In the early 1900s, oral history projects began collecting testimony from elderly residents about their experiences in the 1800s. These projects should have captured extensive accounts of the Mudflood generation. Instead, they focused almost exclusively on stories that fit established historical narratives, pioneer tales, immigration experiences, business success stories. The interviews that might have captured testimony about catastrophic urban change, about watching cities buried and rebuilt. Those interviews either weren't conducted or weren't preserved. When historians did occasionally interview survivors who mentioned unusual events, their accounts were filtered through frameworks that made them fit conventional narratives. An elderly resident describing watching the streets of their childhood neighborhood being razed might be recorded as discussing civic improvement projects. Someone mentioning buildings being buried might be documented as talking about basement construction. The testimony existed, but it was translated, interpreted, made to fit a story that had already been decided. This translation of experience into acceptable narrative becomes especially clear in newspaper archives. Local papers in the 1870s and 80s occasionally published letters or reports from residents describing confusion about ongoing construction, questioning why entire streets were being covered, wondering about the official explanations. These pieces exist in archive collections, but they were never indexed, never compiled, never treated as historically significant. They were filed as local color or community interest, not as evidence of something larger. The few survivor accounts that did make it into preserved records share common elements that official histories ignore. They describe the changes as sudden, not gradual. They express confusion about the explanations they received. They mention authority figures providing conflicting information, and they often note that asking too many questions was discouraged. These elements appear across multiple survivor fragments, in different cities, in different languages, suggesting a consistent pattern of experience that contradicts official narratives of orderly urban development. The institutional response to survivor questions appears to have been remarkably consistent. Provide a simple explanation focused on civic improvement. Emphasize progress and modernization. Avoid detailed technical discussions. And most importantly, move forward without dwelling on the past. This approach wasn't explicitly documented as policy, but its consistency across different cities and institutions suggests coordination, or at least shared understanding of how to manage public perception. What happened to the Mudflood generation itself? The demographic evidence suggests several possibilities, none of them comfortable. First, many survivors simply left. Migration records from the late 1800s show unusually high movement away from cities that show strong mudflood evidence. People relocated to new territories, to smaller towns, to rural areas. The official explanation attributes this to economic opportunity in expanding frontiers. But the timing correlates too precisely with the period of major urban transformation to be coincidental. Second, many survivors died without their stories being recorded. Life expectancy in the late 1800s was shorter than today. The generation that lived through the Mudflood would have aged and died primarily in the early 1900s, precisely when oral history projects were beginning. But those projects didn't prioritize this specific cohort. By the time historians might have become interested in their testimony, most were already gone. Third, and most disturbing, some survivors may have been actively silenced, not through violence or overt suppression, but through institutional mechanisms. Commitment to asylums increased dramatically in the late 1800s. The criteria for commitment were remarkably broad. Individuals who expressed views that challenged consensus reality, who insisted on memories that contradicted official narratives, who refused to accept simple explanations for complex events. These people could be, and were institutionalized. Once committed, their testimony became permanently inadmissible. They were categorized as unreliable, their memories dismissed as delusion. Archive records show that asylum commitments in cities with strong mudflood evidence peaked in the decades following major urban transformation. The official explanation attributes this to increased awareness of mental health issues and improved institutional capacity. But the patient records that survived show something more specific. Many commitments involved individuals described as fixated on past events, unable to accept present reality, or expressing impossible memories about how cities used to look. These aren't isolated cases. The pattern appears across multiple institutions in multiple cities. Individuals committed for insisting their neighborhood looked different than official records indicated. Patients documented as suffering from false memories about street levels or building heights. People institutionalized for refusing to accept that the changes they witnessed were simply civic improvements. Their testimony was pathologized, their memories medicalized, their experience erased by declaring them mentally unfit. The criteria for these commitments were often vague and subjective. A person who insisted too strongly on their own memories over official accounts could be labeled as suffering from delusion. Someone who questioned authorities too persistently might be diagnosed with monomania. The medical language provided cover for what was effectively the removal of inconvenient witnesses from public discourse. And once institutionalized, these individuals' accounts were permanently tainted. Even if they later repeated their testimony, it would be dismissed as the ravings of the mentally ill. Their children might remember their stories, but would be discouraged from repeating them, knowing the stories had been officially declared false. The institutional system effectively eliminated an entire category of testimony by declaring the testifiers incompetent. The children of the Mudflood generation faced their own form of silencing. They grew up hearing their parents' and grandparents' stories about how different the cities used to look. But when they tried to share these stories in schools or with authorities, they were corrected. Their family memories contradicted official histories and standardized textbooks. Teachers informed them their relatives were mistaken or confused. The children learned to stop mentioning these stories, to file them away as family eccentricities rather than potentially valid historical testimony. This educational correction extended beyond individual cases. Curriculum development in the early 1900s emphasized standardized historical narratives. Textbooks presented unified accounts of urban development that left no room for alternative experiences. Local variations in memory were smoothed out in favor of coherent national stories. The result was an educational system that trained each new generation to dismiss precisely the kind of testimony that might have preserved mudflood survivor accounts. By the 1920s and 30s, the last survivors of the mudflood generation were dying. The few who remained and still insisted on their memories were elderly, easily dismissed as confused or senile. Their testimony was treated with the same condescension society often shows toward the very old, their accounts filed alongside other elderly rambling, rather than preserved as potentially valuable historical evidence. And that is when the final erasure occurred. As this generation passed away, their stories died with them. The next generation had learned not to repeat them. The institutional records that might have preserved them had been lost in fires or excluded from archives. The photographs that showed the physical evidence were filed away without context. The survivor testimony that could have explained the mudflood simply vanished, leaving only architectural anomalies and photographs without witnesses to explain them. What remains today are fragments, letters buried in archives that nobody has indexed, photographs filed in collections that nobody has connected, census gaps that nobody has investigated, asylum records that nobody has examined for patterns. The evidence exists, scattered and disconnected, waiting for someone to piece together what happened to the generation that watched the world transform and then vanished from history. The systematic nature of this erasure suggests it wasn't accidental. It required consistent decisions across multiple institutions, multiple cities, multiple countries. Decisions about what records to preserve and what to discard. Decisions about what testimony to record and what to ignore. Decisions about how to categorize experiences that didn't fit established narratives. Whether these decisions reflected coordinated suppression or simply emerged from institutional bias toward confirming existing narratives remains unclear. What is clear is the result. An entire generation's experience was excluded from history. Their voices were silenced, their memories dismissed, their testimony erased. And without their accounts, the Mudflood itself became inexplicable, reduced to architectural curiosities and photographic anomalies that official history chooses not to investigate. The vanished generation leaves behind questions. Nobody in official positions seems willing to ask. What did they actually see? What did they experience? Why were their accounts so dangerous that they needed to be systematically excluded? And what else might we have lost when we erased the testimony of those who lived through whatever the Mudflood actually was? The buildings remember, even if the people have been forgotten. The photographs preserve evidence even without the testimony to explain it, and somewhere in archives and asylum records and forgotten letters, the voices of the vanished generation still wait, silenced but not completely destroyed, for someone willing to listen to what they tried to tell us before they disappeared.